This lecture will be on the economy of the 1920s, particularly the early 1920s, from the era of normalcy to the beginning of the Great Depression. And we're going to look at this era principally through the lens of the presidents of this era, the first of whom is Warren G. Harding. Harding was the Republican nominee from Ohio who was a glib talker, and he made up his own phrases, which the press liked a great deal. He was almost as good as Theodore Roosevelt at gaining press attention because of his phrasing, but he also seemed a little bit wacky in his phrasing. He was a journalist from Marion, Ohio, and a skilled writer and a skilled politician who seemed like a hail fellow well met, a kind of a good old boy, definitely the kind of guy who appealed to the mass of people because he appeared to be so much like them. Anyway, he coined the phrase return to normalcy. Normalcy wasn't a word until he made it up. But it actually captured the ideas that Americans had had for themselves, that they wanted to enjoy the fruits of progressivism and wanted to relax from the trauma of World War I. So he campaigned on this theme, return to normalcy. The economy in this normal period recovered from the post-war depression by 1922 and expanded during the rest of the decade. It was also the Harding administration that inaugurated prohibition. The Harding administration set the tone for 20th century republicanism, and normalcy, quote unquote, set the tone for how the Republican Party defined itself throughout the 20th century as a party of big business, not necessarily small business, but of large corporations, a party that wanted reduced government spending and reduced federal taxes, a party that until the latter part of the decade was isolationist. It and Harding promoted high tariffs and protection of the chemical and metal industries, and Harding's idea was to appoint business-friendly regulators who laxly enforced those regulations. It's also an era of imaginative diplomacy. Unfortunately, by imaginative diplomacy, I mean Harding and Coolidge, Hoover, and FDR even were good at diplomacy. They had to balance the American presence in a somewhat bellicose world with the demands of the American people that we return to our borders and shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. Unfortunately, there were, in the Harding administration, a number of scandals. Now, let me start out by saying that he made many very good, indeed outstanding appointments, such as Henry Wallace Sr. as Secretary of Agriculture. And let me caution you right now that there is a Henry Wallace Jr., though we don't call him Henry Wallace Jr., their middle initials were different. Their father and son, one of whom was in the Harding administration as Secretary of Agriculture, one of whom was in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, ultimately becoming vice president. But Henry Wallace the Elder was Secretary of Agriculture under Harding, a very good appointment. Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce, another good appointment. Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, and Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury. Now, for the most part, all of these appointments were conservative progressives. That is, they understood the progressive mentality, and there was no more progressive person, capital P, progressive era, than Herbert Hoover. Yet they were all basically conservative. Probably the most conservative among them was Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury. But regardless of their political bent, they were all fine administrators who had a very good concept of public service as public service. Nevertheless, it's the scandals that mark Harding's administration. These scandals came about because of Harding's group of followers, his posse, you might say, known in the press as the Ohio Gang. The leader of the Ohio Gang was Harry Doherty, who had become Attorney General under Harding, and who was tried for influence peddling in 1927, though he was not convicted. Though he was the most prominent one, he was the last one to be tried. There was a scandal in the VA department, brand new Veterans Affairs Administration, and probably the most newsworthy of these, the things that caught the public, the biggest scandal that caught the public's attention was the so-called Teapot Dome scandal, in which Albert Fall, one of the Ohio Gang, as Secretary of the Interior, made land deals and took bribes to lease the Teapot Dome and Elk Hills oil areas in California and Wyoming to friends of his who were in the oil business. Now, Teapot Dome's not that big a deal unless you remember that Teapot Dome and Elk Hills are the U.S. Navy's oil reserves. That is, they left oil in the ground and they were only supposed to be used for the Navy. But Henry Sinclair and others wanted these reserves and bribed Albert Falls, Secretary of the Interior, to get at these reserves. Eventually, Falls was convicted for bribe taking, and he's the first cabinet member ever convicted of a felony, and that happening in 1929. Well, luckily for Harding, who had his own share of scandal, though some of this personal sexual peccadillos that broke after he died, though it's probably a pretty good thing for him that he passed so soon, or else his administration would be even more besmirched. Because once scandals started breaking, they didn't stop breaking. And had he been still in office, the politics of the whole situation would have gotten pretty ugly. As it was, though, Harding died of food poisoning just as the scandals broke in 1923. The person who replaced him was his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. The way Coolidge accepted the office was very emblematic of the way he perceived the office. Not that he set up the way he received the office, but it is part of this myth that he has about himself. Cal Coolidge was very taciturn. He's probably the most unpolitical politician you would ever run into. He did not have the common touch. He was a kind of cool, even cold man without being overly stern and foreboding. But he just didn't have that human warmth. Nevertheless, he made lots of political friends, and he would take strong stands when he thought that it was appropriate to do so. Well, how did he receive the oath of office? He was visiting his father in the backwoods of Vermont when word arrived by Western Union messenger in the middle of the night at this hunting cabin out in the woods that didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing. And word arrived that Harding had died and that the vice president henceforth would be president. But the vice president had to take the oath of office. So Coolidge's father, who was a justice of the peace, delivered the oath of office to Cal Coolidge in this cabin in the backwoods of Vermont, whereupon they retired to their separate bedrooms and slept the night. Coolidge had this reputation of being somewhat lazy as a president. Some scholarship indicates that he was probably ill with some kind of lupus-like disease that required him to sleep during the day and slowed him down personally. But nevertheless, he believed in a passive presidency, very much like the Gilded Age presidents who no one actually remembers. He was exceptionally conservative. His administration was very pro-business and very anti-union and even anti-worker. He oversaw a legal campaign against the unions that played out in the Supreme Court. He lowered the estate tax in 1924 and 1926. He also lowered the tax rates in 1924 and 1926 from 50% down to 20%. I'm sorry, let me say that again. He lowered tax rates in 1924 to 50%, the top marginal rate, and then in 1926 he lowered it to 20%. Again, he oversaw the highly restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, and he believed that government should offer no assistance to anyone. He vetoed the McNary-Houghton bill that protected farm income 4 times. He also killed off George Norris's attempt to build the government-run hydroelectric system on the Tennessee River, that is the TVA. Norris had been trying to get TVA built for a few years, and Coolidge just put a stop to that. Norris and Coolidge were both Republicans. Well, so what did this lowering of the tax rates do? It flooded the money, or it flooded the economy with money. And whether it led to prosperity or not is arguable, but certainly it is concomitant with prosperity. And in fact, this era is known as the new era in the national economy, a phrase coined by Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce. Remember that Harding presided over an immediate post-war depression. The depression of 1920, 21, 22 was pretty severe. Luckily, it was short. But after 1922, during the last year of Harding's administration, when he was still alive, prosperity began to return. And until 1929, in fact, into 1930, we see a 40% overall increase from 1922 to 1929 in the gross national product. There was low unemployment, and relative wages as well as nominal wages climbed, though they did not climb as much as the gross national product or as much as profits. Now, what fueled this economy? The leading industries, particularly the cheap energy industry of hydroelectric power. Other things that pushed this economy into double-digit increases over the years is mass consumerism, particularly durables, those long-term goods like automobiles, electronics, and appliances. This is the era in which you see radios becoming incredibly popular. The first mass-produced refrigerators started coming out. Vacuum cleaners and other household appliances like that became popular because hydroelectric power was available, particularly in cities. We see also an advancing advertising industry, which took advantage of people's willingness to pay, that is, businesses' willingness to pay to create or at least to channel demand. So the advertising industry developed by leaps and bounds. And that doesn't mean just Madison Avenue. That means little advertising businesses across the country that served local markets. One of the things also that that really pushed this economy was the business of business mergers. This was a kind of something new in the financial world and generated a large amount of money. By 1930, approximately 1,000 businesses per year were being merged. And by 1930 also, at the kind of tail end of all of this era, this new era in the economy, 100 corporations controlled almost 50% of all U.S. business activity. So we see that the economy and politics worked hand in hand from 1921 until about 1930. We had the Harding administration's return to normalcy, definition of the Republican Party as being pro-business and low tax, anti-immigrant, and unfortunately for Harding, his administration, not the party, was open to significant scandals. These scandals eventually were cleared up. Calvin Coolidge, someone who was not at all prone to scandal, became the president in 1923, ran again in 1926, but did not run in 1928. I'm sorry, he ran in 1924, did not run in 1928. The entire economy was an era of prosperity, or rather, let me say the entire era between 1922 and 29 was an era of prosperity, fueled by mass consumption, hydroelectricity, advertising, and the merger industry. We will continue our discussion of the economy of the late 1920s in our next lecture. Thank you very much.